Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hiltwine, and I'm a member of CIT-CRCF team, and I'm pleased to have you join me for today's webinar that's focused on completing the budget and budget narrative for FY16. All callers have been placed on mute for this session. You may submit questions at any time by expanding your webinar control panel and keying your question into the questions box. All questions will be addressed during the Q&A time at the end of the prepared remarks. As with all CRCF webinars, the slides for today's presentation will be made available online on the solicitation webpage by close of business today. The session is being recorded, and this version will be available to view by the end of the week. During this webinar, we will focus on CRCF matching funds and what can be considered matching funds, completing the budget, both the budget and budget narrative tabs on the template, and then cover a few tips to consider as you're preparing your application and associated financials. As I mentioned, we'll close out the session with an opportunity for Q&A. First, we'll take a look at matching funds in the context of those monies that are supplied towards the project, not in the context of CRCF's matching funds program. Matching funds that we're discussing here are monies that are supplied by the CRCF applicant that meet or exceed the amount of funds requested for the project. The match must mirror both the total and annual amount of funds requested through CRCF. Matching funds are a required element for the commercialization, eminent researcher recruitment, and matching funds programs. Matching funds are not required for the SBIR or STTR matching funds programs, as the match component is fulfilled by the federal SBIR or STTR awards. Matching funds cannot be identified or secured after the CRCF award is made. Matches must also be active and available during the proposed CRCF project's period of performance. For example, if an applicant secured matching funds during a 3-year grant and are wrapping up year 1 of this award, funds that have already been expended cannot be used as matching funds towards the CRCF project. Neither can funds that will be expended after the CRCF period of performance. Matches, at a minimum, must be 1-to-1. Examples of matching funds can be seen on the slide here and within the CRCF FAQs document. These include labor and/or fringe, consumables, purchased equipment, and federal, private, or other grants or contracts for the same work proposed in the CRCF application and aligned with the CRCF project's period of performance. Waived indirect costs are also acceptable sources of matching funds. Essentially, you would not be asking CRCF to cover your overhead and/or G&A costs, but these would count towards your 1-to-1 match. In general, whatever contribution is made must be specific to the CRCF project. Funds received from the CIT gap funds or state contracts or grants are not eligible sources of matching funds. If you are a university applicant, however, contributing salaries or indirects, which may be state monies, are an acceptable match. The budget and budget narrative templates are within a single Excel document, but are broken down into 2 separate tabs. Both the budget and budget narrative must be completed and uploaded, still as a single Excel document, into your online application. Templates for the budget and budget narrative, like that for the proposal, are program-specific and available for download from the URL on your screen and then by clicking on the specific program. Matching funds, if applicable, should be recorded and explained with the required level of detail on both the budget and budget narrative. This level of detail is called out in each set of guidelines, but is also available within both tabs of the budget template. On the budget template, you'll see a combination of white and yellow cells. Enter data for your CRCF budget into the white cells. Yellow cells are formula-driven and pre-populated. They're also locked. If your CRCF project will last longer than 1 year, contact the CRCF team at crcf@cit.org to request a multi-year template. Additionally, on both the Budget and Budget Narrative tabs, be sure to enter the CIT reference number and project title in the appropriate blanks. The CIT reference number is a unique number CIT assigns to your project at the time your LOI was converted into a program application. This number can be found pre-populated within your online questionnaire. This is a sample of the Commercialization Program budget template. However, all program templates will look very similar. The bottom of each budget has cells to calculate the percentage of CRCF requested funds for direct and indirect costs. Those projects requesting funds to cover indirect costs only are reviewed more favorably. Direct costs are those costs going specifically toward the project, such as labor, materials, or consultants, while indirect costs are those such as overhead or G&A, costs of doing business that cannot be solely directed for the CRCF project. Program-specific caps exist on indirect costs, so as you're preparing your project budget, consult the guidelines for this information. To complete the budget, note the budget categories by line. Columns separate the CRCF request and match. A reminder that each match, for programs that require one, must equal or exceed the total amount of CRCF requested funds. If you are an applicant under the SBIR or STTR matching funds programs, additional matching funds may be provided, but are not required since the federal award serves as the match. Therefore, the column for the match and the corresponding section on the budget narrative need only be completed if additional funds are being provided. The purpose of the budget narrative is to understand how the applicant expects to spend CRCF funds. It also identifies the source or sources, amount, and uses of matching funds. For CRCF funds intended for indirect costs, cite the requested rate or rates, your organization's approved rate or rates, and who approved this rate, for example, a federal agency. Like with the budget worksheet, when filling out the budget narrative, enter data only in white cells. All the white cells have wrap text enabled, so when submitting, please make sure this is still intact and that all of your content is visible. This will help CRCF reviewers capture all of your information during the review process. Please note that correctly completing the budget, and especially the budget narrative, are expectations of all submitted applications. Review program guidelines carefully for the required level of detail in the budget narrative. Applications that do not comply with program guidelines will not proceed past initial review. An example of the commercialization budget narrative is seen here. At a high level, each budget narrative should explain the amounts and categories of requested and matching funds and detail how these monies will be used and what they will cover. In all cases, we ask you to provide as much detail as possible. All requests are closely scrutinized and must be justified as critical to the project's success. I'll use the next minute or two to provide some examples of what we're looking for on a budget narrative. For example, if funds on the budget are allocated for labor, your narrative should explain the who, what, and how much. For another example, say that you have 2 researchers supported by the same CRCF project. Indicate the salary for each person, the time they will spend working on the project, and in total, the amount requested for their labor. If funds are expected for fringe, indicate the fringe rate, how you came up with this rate, and what it covers. Under consultants and subcontractors, you might put funds towards an attorney or patent filings, or a subcontractor who will process samples. In this category, explain the funds requested and what they will cover. Also indicate the location of the subcontractor or consultant. If any work will be done outside of Virginia, this must be explained and justified. Also indicate why this individual was chosen. As a final example, if monies will be directed toward equipment, describe what is being purchased and its use for the CRCF project. A reminder that CRCF is not a major equipment acquisition program. If limited funds are being sought for equipment, applicants must indicate why alternatives to procurement, such as leasing or using one at another organization, are not viable, and need to demonstrate that the equipment is required to advance the development of the specific product or technology proposed for the CRCF project. Indirect costs may not be charged on equipment. One question we routinely get is whether items are considered materials or supplies or equipment. CRCF defines materials and supplies as consumables, disposables, or other short lifespan items. These are typically less expensive than items categorized as equipment. Equipment has a useful life of more than 12 months. This year, a portion of your CRCF request may go to support market validation activities. In the updated FAQs, updated this past month, we've defined these activities as follows. Market validation helps you determine your target market, if market feedback for your concept or technology is positive, and if there's sufficient willingness to purchase your product or service when it's ready. Examples of what falls under market validation include online or other market research, including acquiring and reviewing reports, conducting surveys and interviews, and performing competitive analyses, holding market or sales meetings, attending conferences to assess competition and/or meet with clients or potential clients, developing a marketing plan and/or marketing materials, and developing websites. Up to 10% of the CRCF requests can support market validation for the commercialization, SBIR matching funds, and STTR matching funds programs, and up to 5% of the CRCF request can support these activities for the matching funds program. Although CRCF does not provide sample proposals, this year we have prepared and made available a sample project budget. The URL to download will be available on a following slide. In our application webinars, we've covered tips to create strong proposals. I highly recommend you take a few minutes to review one of the recorded sessions. Yesterday's will be available by the end of the week, along with this one, or at least view the slide deck, which is available now. Today, I'd like to highlight a couple of tips to keep in mind when preparing your project budget, as these are things that we've seen or not seen in some of the strongest overall applications. Reviewers look for precision in the budget that requested funds are appropriate and specific to the proposed project. We recommend that applicants run their own calculations to ensure the total amount of requested funds is equal, for example, to the total rate of pay for key personnel and the amount of time that they'll commit to the project. Overall, there should be consistency throughout the proposal and budget, such that information included in the budget and budget narrative maps to the key personnel and the work plan, for example. Finally, and I can't stress this enough, you must use current program-specific templates for your FY16 project budgets and proposals. If your submissions are not prepared in accordance with the guidelines, including format and content, it will not advance past initial review. CIT will not outreach to applicants for clarification or more information. Again, all templates can be downloaded from the program pages from the Documents window in the top right-hand corner. Complete information on the FY16 solicitation is available via the URL on your screen. Here you'll find a recently updated FAQs document that address many of the common questions about CRCF, that sample budget that I mentioned, and the links to review other recorded webinars. Should any of the previously mentioned resources not give you the answers that you're looking for, my team will be glad to help. We can be reached at any time throughout the solicitation by emailing crcf@cit.org. A reminder that all applications are due by noon on Monday, February the 1st. This concludes the prepared portion of the webinar. I'd now like to invite any questions that you may have. Questions can be submitted by expanding the webinar control panel and using the questions option. I'll address everything in the order that they come in as best possible for the benefit of all participants. If a question requires more information, I'll follow up with that individual separately after the session. The SBIR Matching Funds Program does not need to have a match, but will it help the company's application if they match funds in addition to the SBIR grant? Yes. So while it's not a requirement and it's certainly not points against any application that's submitted, reviewers love to see additional skin in the game and that there's a real commitment to the project. So any matching funds for any program that are provided over and above that one-to-one match, or in the case of SBIR and STTR, above that federal award, are viewed favorably. In trying to provide as much detail as possible, are there restrictions on the fonts and font sizes? So for the budget narrative, there are not restrictions on the amount of detail. The sample budget and budget narrative that was provided this year was meant to help guide the types of information and the level of detail that we're looking for. This would be the minimum level of detail, and we've certainly seen some very strong applications that provide more detail. Perhaps it's a greater cost breakdown, specifics for the exact materials and supplies that may be purchased, including where they're coming from. So as you're sitting down to prepare those budgets, I highly recommend that you take a look at that sample and pay attention to the required level of detail that are in the templates and in the guidelines. If you choose to provide more level of detail, we understand that that certainly lengthens the budget narrative, but there is not a restriction on how long it can be or font sizes or any of that information. Is there a limit on the percentage of effort for the named PI, whether a minimum or a maximum? And there is not. So certainly the PI could be spending a portion of their time, let's say that they're balancing that between teaching classes, or they could be on a sabbatical, or this is their full-time job if it's a private sector company. And the amount of time that is required to accomplish the project is sufficient for our information. So no minimum or no maximum. Can time spent developing a product be considered as matching funds? So for most of the CRCF projects that we've seen, and we may need to connect separately on this, the idea is that there should already be a product in mind, and the end goal is commercialization. So while there are different stages that the technology development can be at, most of them should have an idea that's created. If it's something such as developing that prototype, certainly labor efforts or materials that may be purchased could be provided as matching funds. But in terms of sort of thinking about the product, I'm not sure that that falls in line with what we're envisioning for the CRCF program. So if I haven't directly answered that question for that individual, please let me know and let's follow up after this session. We have a great question about sort of the idea of effort and matching funds. So for a lot of our startup companies, the principal investigator may not actually be receiving a salary. Perhaps you're the CEO or a founding member of your company and don't actually collect tangible funds for the effort that you're putting forth as you're getting your company started. We see this fairly frequently, and what we ask is that if you're going to be considering the effort that you're putting forth as matching funds, you would cite what the amount of time that you're spending on the CRCF project, what your rate would be if you were collecting that salary, being mindful of a reasonable rate for that salary, and so monetizing essentially what your effort that you're committing to CRCF would be. So the short answer is yes, if you spend that time, that would be considered matching funds. So a few examples of common items that we see in proposals that we wouldn't want to fund. One of the things that we're being very mindful of this go round is travel costs. So while travel is included as a budget line item, those costs would be very closely scrutinized, and everything is being scrutinized as being critical to the project. But really the idea of going to conferences or making those travel plans, so that's something that we will be monitoring very closely. Equipment is another one, and it's really on a case-by-case basis, but I mentioned that we're not a major equipment acquisition program. And by that, we're not looking to fund a project for the sole purpose of acquiring a piece of equipment. So if we're going to make a $50,000 award, the funds should really be spent on the technology development efforts, the labor, the working with a consultant or a subcontractor, those materials, things like that, as opposed to spending the bulk of funds on a piece of equipment. That's not to say we don't see those requests or fund the request for a limited portion, and limited doesn't have a monetary value associated with that. But it really is as it's presented in your proposal and justified in your budget narrative, an understanding of how it's helping to advance the project. And all of our CRCF projects will go through a multi-level review. And I didn't touch on that during the budget webinar, though I did in yesterday's application webinar. But one of those review steps is through subject matter experts. And they review not only your proposal, but also the budget and budget narrative and any of the materials that are provided in the appendix. And they'll look to make sure that what you're proposing and the amount of funds that you're requesting by category makes sense. So at a very high level, they'll look to see, is it a reasonable cost associated with the effort that's being asked and the technology development steps that are being proposed. And so if their assessment leads us to believe that everything is really worthy and makes sense and is justified appropriately, we usually go on that information. So as we're thinking about things that CRCF does not want to fund, it's really looking to those experts in your particular field for a lot of that information. Information that you can provide to CRCF over and above what's being asked for that helps to show the path toward commercialization, your company's commitment towards advancing the projects, connections that you've made, whether it be partnerships, the opportunity to present at conferences or meet with potential clients. Any of that type of information is really helpful to paint the big picture of your CRCF project. So even if you are not asking CIT or the CRCF program to fund certain activities, if they are part of your overall plan for advancing the technology, please do include that information. Our guidelines and the templates show a minimum of information that we're looking for in any given CRCF project. Things that we definitely want to see and that we're seeking for a better understanding of what you're proposing and how it's going to impact the Commonwealth and the industry overall. But certainly if there are other things that we have not included as part of those guides, but that are important to your particular commercialization path and the development of your technology, we welcome any and all information above what we're asking for. So we provide the minimum level, and anything that you feel that you need to share over and above that is great. I want to thank everyone for taking about half an hour out of your Wednesday afternoon, and we really look forward to receiving all of your applications in about 2 weeks. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.